Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode I have on a rabbi, meditation teacher, lawyer, activist, and many other things, Jay Michaelson, to talk about the intersection of spirituality, religion, and political struggle, the role that capitalism plays in climate change. Some of our political disagreements come out, which is really fun to go back and forth a little bit on. And we just cover a lot of ground, including, of course, spiritual and religious suffering and how to turn suffering into something productive that can be used to alleviate the suffering of others. So all in all, this is a really fun, wide-ranging conversation with a really cool, intelligent, insightful, and just overall friendly human being. So I think everybody will really enjoy this. And as always, if you like what we do here at Rev Left Radio, you can support us by going to patreon.com/Rev Left Radio, signing up to the Patreon, and in exchange for a few dollars a month, you get access to bonus content. We are 100% listener funded, always will be, so it's incredibly important and appreciated to get that level of support. And if you can't give financially, doing something as simple as sharing these episodes with a friend or leaving a positive review on iTunes can be very helpful. You know, we have a funny little rating where the vast majority of our ratings are 5 stars, and then we have barely any 2, 3, or 4 stars, and then we have like a significant portion of 0 stars or 1 star or whatever, and those are all from, you know, right-wing people. Sometimes we'll have waves of them coming and downgrading the show to try to make us look shittier and to decrease our reach, etc. So every positive review goes a long way in counteracting that nonsense, and we really appreciate it. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Jay Michaelson.
Hi, I'm Jay Michaelson. I'm a meditation teacher, former LGBTQ activist, and I'm a columnist for New York Magazine.
Yeah, well, welcome to the show, Jay. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you on. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. You come out of a background that's both politically oriented as well as spiritually and religiously oriented, which is an intersection that I'm personally interested in and have covered quite extensively on this show. But to begin, just to help orient our listeners to who you are, can you just talk a little bit more about your political and your religious background in particular?
Sure. Yeah. So I've definitely for the last, 20 or so years, I've worked at that intersection, politics and religion, politics and spirituality. So I, on my kind of spiritual religious path, I was born and raised in a Jewish tradition, and am now also an ordained rabbi. That kind of came late, so I'm going out of chronological order. And that's my root tradition, but I'm also authorized to teach in a Theravadan Buddhist meditation tradition, Sri Lankan lineage. And so my Buddhist practice, which has also been in 15, 20 years at this point, is kind of central to my outlook on how problems can be addressed from a sort of inner and outer basis at the same time. And again, that sort of nexus of activism and contemplative practice. Professionally, so I graduated law school and did a few different things, and have worked kind of in an activist space in one form or another for the last 20 years. I spent 10 years as an LGBTQ activist, mostly working in religious communities. I wrote a book a while ago called God versus Gay, The Religious Case for Equality, arguing that mainstream kind of Western religious values favor inclusion and diversity. So wasn't a compromise, but that's actually living out those values. And transitioned around 10 years ago to working more in the journalism field. So for a while, I was the Supreme Court columnist at the Daily Beast and doing opinion writing. So it was activism with a pen, I guess, instead of kind of on the ground. And have written a lot about the intersection of kind of law, religion, sexuality, and lately also in the last 5 years, climate change, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later. It's funny, I've kind of come full circle because when I started law school, I was focused on climate change. That was some of the first work I did back in the 90s, so a million years ago. And now for me, it's seeing where our biases and limitations of the human mind are literally impacting the earth, but impacting our inability to do anything about maybe the most pressing crisis of our time.
Yeah.
That's the first time I've given that short summary. I hope that landed.
Yeah, it did. It's really interesting. Just as a side question, How did you come to be interested in Buddhism and Buddhist practice? Obviously, you're born into a Jewish tradition, but what pushed you in the direction of Buddhism and meditation?
It's funny, a lot of kind of podcasts on spirituality subjects often start with the question like, "Were you a weird kid?" And I definitely was. I liked spending time alone and in nature. I always had that kind of impulse or wiring. There might be some sort of cultural and social reasons for that. I'm not saying it's literally like genetic or anything, but for some reason I've always been moved in that direction. And in my 20s, I started getting into meditation. This is kind of before it was fashionable, I guess. And eventually, first I was doing sort of secular meditation and then what I thought was kind of Jewish meditation, but eventually kind of followed those to their roots, which was in Buddhist traditions. So starting in the 2000s, I started doing kind of longer meditation retreats, 3-month retreats, and long periods of time in silence. And that became sort of my main contemplative orientation. So even though I still work in the Jewish community and practice in that way, it's very much infused with what's now called kind of a Buju sensibility, the Buddhist Jewish sensibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting mixture, and both those traditions are ancient and beautiful in their own ways. I'm wondering, as both a rabbi and a Buddhist meditation teacher, if you can talk about like some of the overlap and possibly even the tensions between those two traditions in particular.
Sure. I mean, for me, I think a lot of what I used to say, and I guess it's still somewhat true, is that my mind is very Buddhist, my heart is very Jewish. Mm-hmm. Now that I said that just now, I'm not sure I still feel that way, but that's still sort of true. I think I'm not a traditional theist. I don't have sort of a traditional God belief. I wrote a book a number of years ago called Everything is God, sort of a pantheistic iteration of mystical theology. But I don't have this like the old man in the sky view. So that's sort of the Buddhist mind. And I see the challenge of human existence the way the Buddha did, suffering and the end of suffering. We experience suffering, and in dealing with it, we create suffering for more people. One of the quirks about how Western Buddhism developed was that it developed out of a kind of monastic tradition that didn't have a lot of social justice engagement. Now, for the last 200 years, there are a lot of forms of engaged, socially conscious Buddhism. But the roots of that tradition don't have that. And so for me, I've actually been animated a lot by the Jewish social justice orientation, which is very strong, not necessarily lived by every Jewish person or Jewish state in the world, but at least, in the tradition and in the texts and in the community, there's a strong activist orientation and a very progressive kind of Jewish tradition, certainly in the West for the last 150 years. So kind of those pieces sort of fit in together. So I love like the sort of Jewish folk practices, whether it's lighting candles on Friday night or the holidays and things like that. But I don't have what some would consider traditional Jewish beliefs about God or commandment or afterlife or things like that. I'm much more focused on the here and now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. We've done a lot of work recently on the 17th century Portuguese philosopher Spinoza, coming from a Jewish tradition, but articulating a sort of pantheistic vision of God, a single substance, etc. So it kind of dovetails with what we're talking about here a little bit, and that opens up this question, which is, what religious or philosophical thinkers from any tradition, historical or contemporary, have influenced you and your thinking the most?
Yeah, it's hard to like pick 5 or 10 out of the field. I think on the Jewish side, I mean, the one that comes to mind is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with the civil rights movement in the 60s and who came out of a Hasidic Jewish mystical dynasty, left that world, became kind of a startling progressive Jewish thinker in terms of his spiritual writing and teaching, but also very much in an activist world. He said one time when he was marching with Dr. King that he felt he was praying with his feet. That's definitely how I see the best kind of prayer. Is one that's active and that's activist and that's motivated by compassion, not by supernatural beliefs, but by a real desire to change the world. That's probably true. I think for my second one, I might name a contemporary of mine, Rabbi Jill Hammer, who's a sort of pagan Jewish priestess rabbi who has really transformed how I think about these traditions in general. There's a poem by Adrienne Rich, a wonderful sort of lesbian Jewish poet of the 20th century, called Diving into the Wreck, that when we engage with these traditions, we're diving into a kind of shipwreck. And there are treasures in there, but let's not forget that it's a shipwreck of patriarchy, a shipwreck of oppression. Adrienne Rich uses the words, we're reading a book in which our names do not appear. And Jill Hammer has been one of the people who's really helped me see how to do that, how to engage with a tradition and a history that's so problematic, and keeping our eyes wide open, while also, maybe diving for the treasure that might be there.
Yeah, I love that metaphor of a shipwreck with any of these traditions. I mean, history weighs upon the mind of the living like a nightmare, as it was once said, and so any tradition that goes far back enough is going to be sort of shaped and molded by the lesser aspects of human nature, if you will. So I like the way that's put. So, yeah, on that point about Abraham Joshua Heschel, I actually heard of him through Cornel West, who is another one of these figures who, marries social justice activism to a spiritual tradition in a really effective way, and does both a service in the process. So if I wanted to, I've wanted to dive into Heschel's work, would you have a recommendation off the top of your head of where I should possibly start to dive into his work?
Yeah, there's an anthology of his work called Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity. And, some of his stuff, that's, I would go number one in terms of certainly the intersection. On just the spiritual side, he has these sort of longer books of philosophy, which can be, a bit of a handful. He has a short book called The Sabbath, which is about the practice of keeping the Sabbath, but which is really about his kind of notion that religion is the art of learning to live in amazement. And then how do we respond to that amazement? Right. So it's not just about getting high and having the amazing experience, but then how does that change your life? And what are the imperatives that you have to other people and to the earth as a result of that encounter with the numinous, with the mystery? So I think The Sabbath is an easy read, and the Moral Grandeur anthology is a good sort of sampler of his work.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely get those right after this recording. That's awesome. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah,
do it on my Amazon page. Just kidding.
Absolutely. All right. Moving forward a little bit and talking about a book that you wrote in 2015, you wrote a book titled "The Gate of Tears: Sadness and the Spiritual Path." Suffering with, in my case, and in the case of many others, I think a little help from psychedelics is what put me personally on a spiritual path in my teenage years, and continues to be an impetus for spiritual practice. Listeners of the show probably know that over the past few months I've lost both my dad and a baby, so grief and loss have been very predominant in my life for the last year, not to mention all the social stuff with the pandemic, mass death, climate chaos, etc., adding to that. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that book, The Gate of Tears, and specifically what Judaism and Buddhism can uniquely offer to people in periods of loss, despair, suffering, etc.
Thanks. And as I expressed over our emails, I'm moved and, feeling a lot of empathy for some of the loss that you've experienced.
Thank you.
I had a kind of a strange pandemic in which I had a lot of mentors of mine die, but none of COVID. They're just during the year 2020, 21, I lost 4 of my kind of key mentor figures. And it was strange that there was, on the one hand, this global loss and grief that we still not processed. And on the other hand, my own loss just over that period of time, which wasn't exactly the same. And it sounds like yours wasn't either. Right. And yet, you're in this period of grief while the world is as well. For me, I think The Gate of Tears came out of both extraordinary sadness and ordinary sadness, just, the kinds that we might feel every day. And from the Buddhist perspective, it's not, these feelings aren't things to banish. It's just a thing. They're perhaps uninvited house guests of the mind that we might maybe welcome in, or at least greet as a friend. And it's kind of the attempt to make everything bad go away, I think, that gets us into trouble. The resistance to the sadness rather than the sadness itself. That's where kind of that suffering comes from. And in fact, sadness and loss can be incredibly generative. You've experienced that. It generates art, and it generates connection and solidarity with others. It generates compassion and caring about others. When we experience really grief and loss, and that's also true for those of us who've had some experience of marginalization or oppression, we can see it. And with someone else, we don't want them to have that experience. So for myself, this is kind of the spiritual intersectionality piece, where I'm obviously very privileged as a kind of, relatively middle-class white guy in America. I've also experienced a little bit of marginalization for being queer. And so when I see other people experiencing that, being on the wrong end of privilege or being on the wrong side of oppression, I kind of can draw on my own experiences of pain, not to say it's the same or comparable, obviously nothing like that, but just to say, well, oh yeah, I kind of might have a sense about what it does feel like to be othered in that way, or to be, marginalized or stigmatized by society in that way. So that's that experience of being present with our grief or with our loss opens us to empathy and to solidarity. I feel like if someone hasn't suffered, it's a lot harder to kind of really get someone else's suffering. So that's kind of, that last piece is really more from the Jewish tradition. My favorite verse from the Bible is, do not oppress a foreigner or a stranger, because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. So that shared experience of slavery is meant to inspire ethical action toward those who we might easily marginalize. But it comes from that experience, right? And whether it's the experience of slavery in Egypt is an imaginative memory and a collective one. But we all have our experiences of grief and loss that are direct. And from that, I think, can come all kinds of wisdom and action. And so that's sort of what that book is about. And that's been a really nourishing bit of wisdom for me over these last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. For me, specifically focused on the Buddhist tradition, which I know the most about and have engaged with the most, there is this, this ability over, years and years of practice to, as you say, be present with difficult emotions, open yourself up to the waves of grief or the depths of sadness in a way that before practice I would have tried to repress, escape, squirm out of, etc. And through that radical openness to the experience of something like grief, I think there's a healthy processing that goes on and a facing of the challenging emotions that can deepen you, and the nuances of differences between negative emotions. Like, grief is not the same as depression and is not the same as sadness, and to be sort of curious and to explore these emotions and to find where they overlap and how they differ, I think is a fascinating, insightful practice that comes out of being able to hold your attention for a period of time, through a practice like meditation. And then the turning of suffering into compassion, I think, is real heroic spiritual work. Losing a baby or now that I've lost a parent, there's the pain and the acute grief that comes with those losses, or in the case of a miscarriage, the lack of a future that could be. But there's also now this new understanding that I have with every human being who's ever lost a parent or every human being who's ever miscarried a baby. And, to be able to open up to that core of humanity at the center of that suffering, and to sort of universalize your suffering on one level is like, yes, this is my suffering, but it's also the suffering of humanity. And that generates so much compassion. Now, the next time a friend of mine loses a parent, or, God forbid, goes through a miscarriage or loses a child, I'll be able to connect and help and maybe guide and be a touchstone for them when they're going through their grief. And that turning around and turning one's suffering into compassion for others, and then acting on that, right? That's the core feature of what makes that useful, is the going out in the world and acting on that radical compassion to help alleviate the suffering of others, I think is truly profound. And it's a process. It takes time, but it deepens you as a human being in ways that few other things can.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. I remember when my mom was having chemo. She was in Midtown Manhattan for chemotherapy, and she had finished the session. And these are long, hours long sessions, and I had to get us a taxi to get home. And so I was out on the street while she was like waiting in the lobby of the hospital, and I felt like, I was getting this very unusual taxi, but I was just some guy on the street, right? Nobody else knew that I was like trying to get a taxi for my mom, who was, dying of cancer and just had chemotherapy. And then I kind of looked around, and that's true for everyone on the street, right? Like there's no, I live in New York City. You don't know who you're next to on the street, and what they're going through and what their suffering is in the past or the present. And it was something that it felt really connecting. I had just imagined everybody trying to hail a taxi or something. I don't know why I didn't get an Uber, but I was trying to get a taxi specifically. Anyway, it was like, you just sort of see them in a different light, and connecting the dots, to some of the political stuff that I know we're going to talk about. For me, it's that kind of just basic core empathy that sometimes seems so missing on the right. Oh, well, who cares about so-called, quote unquote, illegal immigrants or whatever, like, if you just spend even a moment, getting to know somebody's story, of course you care about, right, people who are undocumented and who are, in some process of migration for whatever reason, or, oh, who cares about, trans kids or whatever. Like, I have some stereotype or some fear, and I'm not going to, if you actually get to know anyone who's trans, and I have a number of trans friends, like you get it, right? It's just about humanity and wanting people to be able to flourish and be who they are, and not suffer and not feel the stuff that we've just talked about. So I think there's, to me, a direct connection between being present with that grief and suffering, and then the empathy that leads to a kind of political program. And that's also true, obviously, for climate change as well, which is, could become the great humanitarian catastrophe of the coming century.
Yeah, exactly. And that idea on the right, obviously there are people on the right who have compassion or whatever, but generally speaking, especially many of those who claim to be genuine followers of Christ, lack an ability, it seems, to empathize with another human being, and that increases with the how different that human being is to them, or how they view that person as being different. And in a lot of cases we see with right-wingers, public figures, that until it happens to them, until something touches them directly, they're not willing to be empathetic or to try to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else. So, like, the classic example is I think Dick Cheney, anti-gay marriage until one of his daughters comes out as gay, right? Right. And you can go
we're
down
even
the
seeing
line.
It now with COVID, right? I mean, we're seeing people who are denying science and denying any sort of public health, like, oh, this isn't real or this or that. And then all of a sudden they get sick. And then they suddenly turn on a dime. It's like, oh, wow, everyone take this seriously because I got sick. It's like, well, geez, weren't you paying attention, when 500,000 Americans died of this thing? Like, yeah. So I think it is that sort of disconnect that's aided by, and it's not to other right wingers. We all have all of these capacities within ourselves, right? Everyone, I certainly have the capacity to not care about someone else, or to give into fear, or to let anger make decisions, as opposed to empathy and compassion. So it's not like they're different from me. I'm just as implicated, but it's which part of ourselves do we hand the microphone to? Exactly. Which inner voice do we want to amplify? And I think there's that, I forget the exact metaphor, but it's like we have two animals, one on each shoulder, the kind one and the anger-based, cruel one. Which one is stronger is the one that you feed, right? It's not like we all have them. It's just which one do we want to nourish? Absolutely.
Yeah, and being aware of, in Jungian terms, your shadow, or those aspects of yourself that you would rather look away from or discard or repress or escape. Being aware of those aspects allows you to work through those aspects, and allows you to have a much less dogmatic and holier-than-thou view of yourself and others in the world, knowing how flawed and imperfect in minute detail that you are helps you to accept and understand those frailties in humans around you, and to not expect, the impossible from finite, imperfect beings. And so even that realm of work can be very productive in that sense.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, let's go ahead and move into the climate change and the political action part of this conversation. And I came across you in an interview you did with 10% Happier, and you talked about climate change, and you had this wonderful argumentative position about the necessity of collective political action and a sort of rejection of the sort of hyper-individualist lifestyle, consumer choices that sometimes gets propped up, particularly in spiritual communities, but just within a liberal society more broadly. And I think there's even ample evidence that, big oil fossil fuel companies have promoted the individual carbon footprint narrative in order to say that culpability is all of us and sort of, get it away from them as an institution or divert the eyes from structural analysis of any sort. So can you kind of talk about this problem of hyper-individualism and consumerism in our culture and how spiritual and religious communities can internalize that, and maybe just go over your argument for why, marrying these spiritual practices to political struggle is so essential?
Sure. So, for me, this is kind of where a lot of my energy is right now, in these couple of years. And so, for me, a foundation starting point is a thinker named Joanna Macy. She's a meditation teacher, poet, brilliant writer, and also longtime activist, primarily in environmentalism. And, kind of one of her many kind of guiding points or guiding theses is that for many of us, the pain or the gigantic tragedy of climate change is so great that we just cannot deal with it. And so we compartmentalize it and put it away. And that's true, obviously, for many people who are climate deniers, right? It's like they can't possibly face the enormity of this challenge or of the changes that would be necessary. But it's also true for those of us who do care about climate change, but want to just do something about it and end up doing things that are not necessarily helpful. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to really speak to the climate denier side. I'm hoping that not too many of your listeners are on that team.
For sure.
But many of us are on this kind of second group. Like we care and we want to do something. And so rather than be with the fact of like looking at what's really difficult of what we can and cannot do, we do things to make ourselves feel better, basically. And sometimes these are ethical things and they're good things to do, individual actions that do reduce our carbon footprint. But from a sort of numerical, scientific, data-driven point of view, and this isn't like me making this stuff up. This is kind of, if you look at the Drawdown Project, I think is the best easy resource on the web of just like looking at where greenhouse gases are coming from, carbon dioxide and others, and what needs to be done to draw them down. Individual action is pointless. It has no impact. It has 0.0000, like 1% impact on the world. Even if all of the virtuous people in the world took all of the individual actions that we should do, recycling everything and going to a low waste lifestyle and, living in a smaller house and not driving a lot and not taking airplanes, even if we all did that, it wouldn't move the needle at all on global climate change. And those are just facts, right? That's not an ideological position. That's reality. And the reality is that climate change is driven by a few large industries and large human activities, mostly power generation, also agriculture. And in order to change those things, it doesn't work to drop off the grid yourself. We have to change the grid, right? So even if I conserve electricity, and I should say I drive an electric car, my house is powered by wind power, which is sort of fake, but I do it anyway. In terms of how that works, basically I'm enriching the utility company, but I'm still doing it. Yeah. Like I do these things because they reflect my ethical values, but I'm under no illusion that is what's going to save the earth. It is not. No individual action is going to save the earth. Again, dropping off the grid is a good example. If we don't change the grid for everyone, if there is still a grid, climate change will continue, right? Power generation is a systemic collective issue, and that's just one of many, and we could go through some of the others. So the challenge is that's hard, right? That's hard to do. And you and I will talk about this in a little bit, even if we agree that we want to change the world or change the grid, well-meaning people can have disagreements about how to do that. right? So not only is it difficult to do, but we don't really even agree about how to do it. So that's hard, right? I mean, we're recording this episode as yet another international conference on climate change is taking place. And, like all of the other ones, they're going to come up with some insufficient answers, which we still won't, or policy changes, which we still won't live up to, but it's better than nothing. So we're doing it. That's kind of crappy, right? That's not the kind of empowering individual action that feels good. So even if we're on the left and we don't believe the messaging, around, you can make a difference or whatever, we still have a tendency to fall into that. And I think there is that way of thinking where we do things that don't actually matter. And I think that's because of what Joanna Macy put her finger on, that, we feel like we want to do something. And even if that's something that we do has no impact, that's more comfortable, I guess, than looking at what really has to be done, which are these systemic changes. But as you mentioned, it was big oil that popularized the term carbon footprint, and they did it. And that you can, research that and Google it. It's not hard to, there's documented evidence. It's not like a weird conspiracy theory. It actually was true. Yeah. Here's how to calculate your carbon footprint so you can do your part. And that was a dodge. That was so big oil's responsible for climate change, not you. And they're the ones who have to really change, and we have to force them to change, right, through political power. So that's the idea of putting it on you as an individual was very much a tactic, and it was a tactic to deflect responsibility from where it belongs, which is on systemic, structural, and corporate structures.
Exactly right. One of the analogies, metaphors, whatever that I use to drive this point home about the impotence of individual action when it comes to a global problem like climate change is, I always say, if you and everybody that you personally know, all your friends, family, coworkers, acquaintances, everybody that you have a personal face-to-face, relationship with, all, I usually might say die, but I think that's a little too disturbing. So let's just say raptured, right? Immediately raptured.
That sounds more pleasant. Yeah.
Much more. Raptured off the planet, so you never, did a single carbon footprint ever again. It would still make absolutely zero difference to the overall amount of carbon going into the atmosphere and the problem of climate change itself. And so that just takes the entire apparatus and any hope of having an individualist argument out of play, and it just makes intuitive sense that that's not going to be the way to do it. Now, the point you make about, behaving and living in a way that accurately reflects your ethical commitments, I think, is important in its own right. But you just cannot confuse that with actually making a practical difference in the world. You can do the collective struggle to make the actual difference while also maintaining ethical commitments that you adhere to in your day-to-day life, and I think there is an importance there. But even with all of that, go ahead.
Let me throw in one little piece on that too, which is just this is a point that came from Anthony Lyserowitz, who directs the Yale Center for Climate Communication, which is really my favorite data gatherer. It's a really good data source just for what people think and what motivates behavior change, and just sort of really nuts and bolts. And so he made a nice point about individual action, that it does have a communicative value. So, if I'm generating less waste, let's say, or I'm recycling or something like that, that does have a zero impact on climate change. But it has a non-zero impact on communicating the importance of ecological sustainability to the people who come in contact with me. So there is a value, in addition to expressing our ethical commitments, which I think is one main value. There is a sort of value of being in communication about what's important. So we see people do it. It kind of raises the profile. Part of the challenge in centrist and right-wing communities is no one's doing these things. So we derive social norms from our social communities. And when no one gives a crap about climate change and no one's making any behavior changes in their life, that makes it pretty clear to you that this is not a real issue and not something that you need to think about or worry about. So just adding that in, since I usually bash individual action, and we've now both bashed it for good reasons, just it does have those values of letting other people know what's important. Yeah,
and I completely agree with that. And to your point about, communities where that's not happening, I mean, it's even part of people's political identity to be sort of anti environmentalists to like not believe at all, or to like, you know, make a point of not believing, or to poo-pooing the fact that it even exists as a problem, or that humans even caused it. Like, that's part of people's political identity, which is
right, absolutely,
very difficult.
Right.
Do you remember those bumper stickers like in the early aughts? I think it was after the Iraq invasion. There were those "Pave the Planet" bumper stickers that big trucks would always.
Right.
I just think that is
or like drill baby drill, right? You know, like
exactly.
Let's have more offshore oil drilling to like, you know, have more oil and hurt more ecosystems.
Horrendous.
Yeah.
Some
no, and that, you know, that's like this culture that we're living in of like the best thing you can do is own the libs, right? So
exactly.
like I'm just going to be as much of a schmuck as possible, you know, to like really show it to you, like, you know. And again, we see it in every issue, right? We see it around COVID, we see it around the big lie and voting stuff, we see it, you know, just all the time, this kind of valorization of meanness that is pretty repulsive.
Absolutely. Well, to that individualist point, and specifically within spiritual and religious communities, I'm wondering why and to what extent, I mean, you could disagree with even the premise that in these spiritual communities, there is this turning away sort of like from politics as like a messy, grotesque affair, and fetishizing of individual consumer lifestyle choices instead. Why do you think that exists, and what are just the unique challenges of advancing these sorts of politics in like these deeply religious or spiritual communities in general?
Yeah, it is this sort of endemic challenge. So I, again, would like maybe divide it into a couple of parts. So part of it is capitalism, right? So let's call it McMindfulness, or, you know, McYoga, or whatever, you know, where it's kind of making a lifestyle out of contemplative practices. That's kind of easy, I think, again, for your listeners to kind of spot and rightly ridicule. You know, so it's like, yeah, I mean, if what your meditation practice is about is like finding your Zen by having the exactly perfect candle and looking like Gwyneth Paltrow or something, sure, you know, you're not going to necessarily connect that to social engagement. But okay, so let's move those guys onto a shelf, because that we know about. You know, I think what's more interesting sometimes is to just see that, you know, for a lot of folks, politics harshes their mellow. Like, you know, I want to feel a certain way. I did one time at a meditation center here in New York. I co-led a session called "Why Are You So Sensitive?" You know, social justice and spiritual communities, and it was with a Black activist friend of mine who's also a meditation teacher, who had received all kinds of pushback by talking about racial justice in meditation spaces. And this, I should say, actually was before the kind of reemergence of Black Lives Matter in 2020. This was before the pandemic, so probably around 2018, 2019. So I think some of what we were raising then might not be applicable now, because a lot of spiritual communities did get sort of a wake-up call last year. But at the time, people were like, well, why are we talking about race? I don't want to talk about race. We're talking about meditation, and we're trying to have like, you know, some spiritual thing. And like, don't bring in we were like bringing in, you know, bad vibes into their happy place. And that, you know, it's kind of spiritual materialism, right? And it is a tendency, you know, when you're focused on yourself and you're doing your work on yourself, which I do think is of central importance, right? I'm into that. There is a tendency to just, you know, get into your little kind of cocoon. And that's, I think, some of the work, right? That's some of the challenge. And I think one of the things maybe that this kind of awakening around racial justice has done in some of these communities is realize that that's really a very immature kind of way of looking at practice. Like, if that's clearly not the intended result, whether it's any religious tradition or any contemplative tradition. Obviously the result is not meant to be like, well, I feel good, so done. But you know, you do find that a lot, and politics is really messy. And again, on climate change in particular, it's particularly messy because of the systemic and collective nature of the problem, right? So like a lot of issues we really can think of, well, okay, how can I get my own house in order? And racial justice is half that as well. Like, how can I look at my own privilege? How can I look at my own blind spots? How can I like look at where I'm failing to show up and stuff like that? You know, but then there is this other part of the systemic, and that is really messy. And I think one of the reasons I've personally received pushback about the anti-individual action piece on climate change is like, that's no fun, right? I want to be able to like just do my own gardening and homesteading both of which are very good things to do, and like if and that's my part, I'm doing my part, and that fits my spiritual lifestyle. And, getting involved in, again, whether it's whatever kind of politics it is, whether it's electoral politics or whether it's activist politics, that's like less pleasant. And you come into contact with conflict and with people who disagree. And it's like, that's not as zen, so to speak, as, just focusing on yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a general truth in spiritually seeking communities, that there is some segment of people who are on a spiritual path as a form of escape from the messiness of their own lives, to say nothing of the global political context. And so that can definitely come into play. And to be fair, politics definitely harshes my mellow as well. Like it sucks. like a part of me is like, why do I do this to myself? But it's because there is so much suffering in the world, and politics is a vehicle, if not the vehicle on a collective level, to attempt to redress and address these problems and solve them ideally. So you have to be engaged on that level. But coming to terms with the fact that, to look suffering, global suffering and injustice in the eye is painful and disturbing and sucks. And it is often much more comforting to look away and to recoil into your own personal bubble and your own personal life. The fact is that is a sort of irresponsibility that I think we cannot allow just in a general level. And I would hate to see it in myself, that part of myself that wants to look away and not care anymore because it is exhausting and scary and horrifying. We have to become aware of that and not fall into that. So I think that's a part of it.
Well, and surely there's like a dynamic process here, right? There's like an oscillation, right? Yeah. So it's not just like finding the balance, like just find the right amount of politics for you. I'm not sure that's quite it. I think it's, you go back and forth, right? So you get really engaged, and that involves getting messy and getting dirty, and often, anger and things, emotions like that can be your allies, right? Mm-hmm. You need to get angry about some of these things, right? And then, then you take a step back. So it's like, in dealing with, I kind of learned this from dealing with trauma, that, when somebody's traumatized, you want to you do this thing called pendulation, which is like going back and forth like a pendulum. You get a little bit closer to the painful subject, whatever it is. And then you can with mindfulness in particular as an ally, you can notice when you're getting your word gets overused, but when you're getting triggered, and then you move back a little bit. So if you're a survivor, let's say, of sexual trauma or something like that, or a survivor of violence, you get a little bit closer to that to that source of the trauma, but you also have your kind of attention up to see, okay, I'm too close. Now it's too close. Now I'm triggered in a real way, not the BS way. Like now I'm actually really triggered. I need to move back to whatever spiritual practice or other practice nourishes me, and then I can go in again. And I think that's true for political action as well. It is, I don't want to say it's traumatizing, but it is, it is low level traumatizing to be in some of the mess that activism requires. And so I think it's that going back and forth and then regenerating and being able to go back in. Yeah.
Could not agree more. Perfectly said. Yeah. And that resonates deeply with my own experience on both those fronts as well. Now, on the flip side of this, many people in the political world, activists, organizers, etc., particularly on the left, can be skeptical of spirituality and religion altogether and fail to see its relevance to social transformation and political struggle. So with that in mind, what benefits can meditation in particular offer to those of us engaged in activism?
Sure. First, I want to validate that suspicion. Sometimes religion is the opiate of the masses, and definitely spirituality is too. And we just talked a few minutes ago about how that works, right? I can go to my personal happy place, and then I don't care about the rest of the world because I'm in my personal happy place. So what do I care, right? I mean, that is literally an opiate. Well, I don't know if it's literally. That is metaphorically an opiate, where I feel good, and so I don't think about ending oppression. So I want to validate that skepticism. In my experience, which now, again, is about 15, 20 years of spiritual activism, there are a number of answers to your question. So first is what I just said about regeneration, that having the resources to not burn out is ultimately for the good of everyone. At least if you're on the good team. Maybe I want the people on the right to burn out. but if you're on the left, right? I mean, burnout is real. And we do need tools to regenerate, and we all know that. It's just that a lot of tools that many folks use are themselves actually more destructive. So, I'm certainly not against a good cocktail or other substances, but if that becomes the primary coping mechanism, that can itself have negative effects, right? So let alone right when it turns into abuse of alcohol or drugs or anything else. So having some way to regenerate and come back to what's true and being able to be with the difficult, those are the kind of technologies that I think contemplative practice, meditation, and others can really lead to. Second, for me, I've found that being able to be more aware of sort of the more powerful, potentially destructive emotions has made me more effective. So a story I've told many times is when I was doing LGBT activism, I was giving a talk and I was heckled, basically. And in the moment of being heckled, right, so I was, again, triggered, right? I definitely wanted to shout at this guy and jump down his throat and, punch him in the face. But, thankfully, like there was enough mindfulness present where I could just actually have a little spaciousness around that anger. Like, okay, I'm feeling really angry. I know what that feels like. I feel it in my arms and stuff. And, I can feel the tension building up. And okay, so let's think of like, what's the most skillful thing to do right now in this interchange. And clearly this is like sort of activism 101. Your point is not to try to convince the heckler, obviously that's pointless, but to try to win over everyone else, right? So for me, it was to, in that moment, kind of tell a personal story, an emotional story, and one that clearly made me out to be the more reasonable, but also, kind person in the room between me and the heckler. And that it's not that response is always the right response. Sometimes the right response is to respond with rage or whatever. But the point is that there was that mental spaciousness to be able to decide how to be skillful. And I don't always succeed at that. Actually, just yesterday, 2 days ago, I sent a really angry email, which I try never to do, but actually I still sort of defend that one, but I won't go on a sidetrack about it. It was not political. It was about money, actually. So, but in general, right, having that ability to choose, right, to decide, to respond rather than to react. So again, sometimes anger and rage and stuff is the right tool. Maybe more often than not, it's not. So in addition to the regenerative power of spiritual practice, and for me, that means meditation primarily, there's also the fact that it empowers me to be more effective. And that's maybe the last piece that I would say that, we talked earlier about empathy. And I think for me, having a meditation practice keeps me tuned into what actually matters and alerts me to where I am shutting off somebody else's experience or where I'm not opening to feeling the pain of someone else's experience. So it not only does it make me more effective an activist, it actually makes me care more if I actually just kind of sit and think about it, and just really briefly, I know we're both parents and I have a almost 4-year-old daughter, and, we definitely went through it in the pandemic, like having a then 2-year-old in the pandemic was not easy. But just moving from a moment from our experience, which again, like my kid was really fortunate. I mean, 2 parents, we didn't have financial problems during the pandemic. Like we were very attentive, and just even spending a moment opening to the pain of somebody in a less fortunate, privileged environment. And what the pandemic meant for them, for those kids, and continues to mean in terms of mental health struggles. That leads me immediately to want to have more of a social safety net. That makes me want to have, healthcare that's accessible. That makes me it happens in a very quick way from just inhabiting what it might be like to be, a kid in a challenging environment, a difficult neighborhood or different context. Domestic violence went way through the roof during the pandemic. I mean, just the pain of that leads me very directly to want some pretty significant changes in how we do healthcare in this case, in this country.
Yeah, I cannot stress that enough. That one of the biggest things for me, especially I started meditation, as a late teenager. None of my friends were doing it. I was sort of, 15, 16-year-old, straight white kid, like machismo and all that bullshit. And, trying to be the toughest guy at the party or whatever. And meditation radically expanded my compassion and reoriented my heart towards loving other human beings and caring and trying as best I can to alleviate the suffering of others. I wonder, though, do you think, in your experience, that this radical compassion is always a byproduct of meditation, or have you seen or been aware of people who no doubt have wonderful achievements in the realm of spiritual practice and meditation, but who don't seem to bring along that sense of compassion for others? I mean, there's stories of gurus gone wrong, right?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't even have, I think that's like the $64 question, that's like of my life. And I definitely vacillate back and forth in my answer. So like there was a time in my life earlier, in my meditation practice where I was like, nope, meditation naturally leads to compassion. Like that just is natural. Now I definitely don't. There's just too much contrary evidence. And it doesn't even have to be bad gurus. Like it can just be, again, like mindfulness, or it can be, and we struggle with this. I work at 10% Happier, which, we have a meditation app and a couple of podcasts and stuff. And we went through it, in 2020 in Black Lives Matter. We felt that as a company, we couldn't just be silent about this awakening that was happening. Because being silent was to say something, right? That was to say like, it's not important, or it's like not relevant or something. And so silence for us was not an option. And so we had a number of writers and teachers, writers in the newsletter, which I edit, which by the way is free if people want to get the newsletter. It's at 10%.com/newsletter. I did an advertisement. We had people talk about the intersection of justice work and meditation. And we heard from like a bunch of people who were on the right and who were very upset that we were bringing racial justice into their meditation app, and they were pissed. And these were people who had done a fair amount of meditation. And we continued pissing them off, and we lost some of them. Like they unsubscribed. And, we felt, we don't have any doubt. Like we knew that was the right decision for us to make. Like, it's not like we regret that, but it was definitely a rude awakening to see that. And this wasn't like, we weren't even really being that challenging. We weren't like putting out like abolitionist stuff like on the newsletter. We were just like, here's what unconscious bias looks like, or here's what here's again some of the stuff we talked about, like here the intersection between activism, which can look very angry and justifiably so, and also contemplative practice. And like, so we weren't even putting out like particularly revolutionary material. But no, I mean, unfortunately, it definitely seems like I still think, and there is some data to support this, in terms of empathy, that percentage wise, if you have 100 people doing meditation, 60 or 70 of them will like report increases in empathy, but that's not 100. So it's definitely not sufficient.
To respond to those haters, you should have an entire section of your app dedicated to Malcolm X speeches and see how that.
Yeah, that'll go over well. That's the thing too. We also we also made a decision. We weren't going to censor most of the writers who were writing were Black or people of color, and like we weren't going to like no tone it down. Like we definitely weren't going to do that. Right. But we did make a choice to we're like, well, let's not let's try to not be extra. Like if people have different views about cops or whatever, like people say what they say, but like we're not going to but no, there was no way. Even just mentioning it was enough to piss off a lot of people. And the same thing, we just did it with climate change in the last couple of months. And why are you talking about that? Yeah. I don't know. But it's less about our haters. That's not the thing. But it is definitely true. Look, and there's also forms of meditation. I mean, I'll call it out. Transcendental meditation doesn't have, which TM is very popular, especially with celebrities. It does work as a meditation practice. It can do wonders for people, but it doesn't emphasize. It doesn't come from a tradition that has this strong kind of ethical orientation. And it's really popular on Wall Street. And I know someone personally who taught meditation to the board of directors or whatever of Goldman Sachs, right? So like clearly something is not, some dots are not being connected for folks. And it is possible to abstract out some of the like cool benefits of meditation, on productivity or things like that, and leave behind what I would consider to be some of the essential pieces. So, it depends on the teacher, and it depends on like what the values are and what the emphases are.
Yeah, I totally agree. And rooting my practice in Buddhism and Buddhist culture and Buddhist history, it gives rise to practices that are very relevant to the conscious cultivation of compassion. Like there's entire practices within Buddhism dedicated to just that. There's the concept of the Bodhisattva. There's the whole Mahayana tradition. And every good Buddhist that I've ever studied, read, learned from, etc., has to one degree or another emphasized the impact of ethical behavior on the practice as a whole. And in fact, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path that the Buddha himself laid out stresses, right action, right speech, ethical behavior as part of the path itself. And to try to divorce that component, the compassion and ethics component, from the more just like pure mindfulness insight part of it, I think is an error. But of course, when these things are co-opted and brought into a whole new culture, especially one as rapacious as the U.S. capitalist culture, those things can easily be stripped out.
Although, let me not give Buddhism a pass, because there's plenty of bad Buddhists.
True.
Right. So, there are Buddhist nationalists in Myanmar and Burma who, supported the genocide. And there are a lot of, some of my Buddhist friends want to say, well, those weren't real Buddhists, which I don't know. They're bad Buddhists. They're just like any other tradition. It's big enough. The Buddhism is a big enough civilization to encompass a lot of questionable behavior within it. There were Zen Buddhist priests who supported the Japanese emperor and the empire and militarism, and now there are living Buddhists in Myanmar now today who are supporting violence. So just people are people, right? Totally. There's no system that's pure of the lesser angels of human nature, and that's just who we are.
Yeah, and that's true of every spiritual and religious formation.
Every single one, yeah.
So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more. You mentioned co-option, productivity, the increase of interest in aspects of meditation from Silicon Valley. We've seen the greatest invention of the 21st century, the Amazon Zen booth, be invented recently to ramp up productivity for Amazon workers. But I think it's fair to say that we do differ politically a little bit. I mean, you identify, and correct me if I'm wrong, more as a progressive social democrat, and I'm somewhere more on the Marxist left. So I am curious as to your view on the role that capitalism plays in the climate crisis and ecological destruction more broadly, the conspicuous consumption, the anarchy of market production, incentives towards short-term profiteering in a way for more long-term rational planning, the obvious and corrupting effect of big corporate money on our political system, etc. So what are your views on capitalism and the role it plays or doesn't play in creating and sustaining such crises?
Yeah, I suspect that you and I agree on the diagnosis and just disagree on the treatment. Mm-hmm. So I don't disagree with everything that you just laid out in the litany of bad stuff. And we could just keep doing more litany for the rest of our time. It's just a matter of what to do about it. And I guess I've just, having been a little bit further on the left than I am now, when I was a little bit younger, I'm just purely very pragmatic. And I'm also like a little humble in my views. I could definitely be wrong. Like, it may be the case that the system is so irretrievably corrupted and terrible that trying to do anything within it is a waste of time. That may be true. Of course, we won't know until it's too late, but I'm not so committed or, to my correctness that, I think you're definitely wrong and I'm definitely right. So I think it's like a question of sort of evidence and where's the evidence for successful Marxist revolution and certainly in an advanced capitalist society like the United States. Whereas I can point to evidence of boring ass incrementalist successes. So for me, what's broken about the system is that there's just, we're living in an anti-democratic system. The Senate is anti-democratic. The Electoral College is anti-democratic. These were systems that were set up by white supremacists to be anti-democratic. The system's working very well to do exactly what it's supposed to do. But there are also elements within the system that are democratic and that do occasionally deliver the goods. So, as lousy as the Democratic Party actually is, they deliver a lot of incremental good things. Obamacare is a really good example of that. This is clearly an inadequate solution to our healthcare crisis. But I do think that it's better than what we had before. And I'm just sort of epistemologically very skeptical of the possibility for, really radical change to happen. Mm-hmm. So, and then I'm sort of skeptical that it would even be for the good anyway. So yeah, I sort of told myself I wouldn't quote the John Lennon thing. You say you want a revolution, we'd like to see the plan. I guess I just did quote it, but I meta quoted it, so maybe that doesn't count. Yeah, it just sort of falls apart in the details, and that's even true in a less hard left versus near left thing. It's even true just within, let's say, Democratic Party politics. Like, I was more on board with Bernie's policy proposals than with anyone else's. I just didn't think they were going to win, and I didn't think they would win the primary or the general election. So I just was sort of skeptical that there were enough people who actually agreed with that. And I know there's an argument that, we'll never know until we try. And actually lots of people do agree with it. I get that. But just as a sort of factual evidence matter, I'm not sure that the numbers are really there for those views, but hopefully they will be soon. Right. And if you look at where Gen Z is, where like 18 to 25 year olds are, if 18 to 25 year olds voted as much as people over 60, which they never have in our country, but hopefully maybe one day, right, we would have a very different political culture from what we have. There's a great map. If you just look for the maps of like, if 18 to 25 votes were at the same percentage of, people voting as like 60 to 70 or something like that, like 3/4 of the country is blue, and like by far it's more the left edge of the Democrat Party that would be in power. It would be great. So for me, like, I turn to things that look like boring incrementalist establishment liberal things, like voter engagement and fighting voter suppression, and things which may well look like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and maybe rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. But I would say there's actually very little connection in my choice of that between that and my contemplative practice. That's really driven by empiricism. And again, I might be wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting and honest, and I love having these back and forths. I think no matter where we are on the political spectrum, we tend to silo ourselves into, little groups that only agree with us, and we only hear our own already existing ideas reflected back to us. So, I like having people on that disagree on this fundamental dividing point. But just a couple of things from my perspective is I agree with you that, the classic idea that we're going to have a revolution and topple the U.S. government, and that is not really how things are going to play out. So it's not really the difference between reforms versus a full-scale revolution. But I do think Marxist politics in this context would put us in more of a confrontational posture against institutions like the Democratic Party itself. So as opposed to trying to run a candidate like a Bernie Sanders within it, I think the more Marxist approach would be to point out how the Democratic Party itself is often, almost always, primarily beholden to their donor class. And it's actually, like we see with the reconciliation bill, not Republican pressure preventing Democrats from doing huge transformational things that would really help people in their lives, but it's actually coming from within the Democratic Party itself, as corporations, big pharma, these moneyed elite and their lobbyists don't have to buy off every Democratic politician. They just have to buy off a couple. And you rotate them every 4 or so years, and we're always getting less and less than what we asked for. So in the case of Obamacare, for example, it is wholly, I think, inadequate. And yes, it extends an institution to a few people, but it also gives the Democratic, or more people, millions of people, it also gives the Democratic Party leeway to say, okay, we don't have to worry about that problem now, it's solved. Meanwhile, tens of millions of other people, including myself, go without health insurance, are one catastrophe away from, complete and total bankruptcy. So I don't know if that is the operating difference here, is like, what role does the Democratic Party actually play? And I think from my perspective, it would be one of co-opting more revolutionary grassroots forces and energies, stripping them of anything that can meaningfully challenge the class hierarchy, and offering relatively small or purely symbolic things in exchange for real material change. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we disagree about that. That's not maybe even not that interesting. But, if we don't like what Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are doing in the Senate right now, and I certainly hate what they're doing in the Senate right now, had we flipped a couple of other states, we wouldn't give a crap about those losers, right? So, I was involved tangentially. I want to give myself any credit, but like in the Sarah Gideon campaign in Maine, she's a good she's not even that far left, or a good sort of solid liberal challenging Susan Collins, who's horrible, right? man who's like, we will be single-handedly responsible for, ending abortion rights in this country. Yeah. Right. And we lost badly in Maine. I was also, I was really encouraged by like Cal Cunningham in North Carolina. We lost that one. I was encouraged in South Carolina, challenging Lindsey Graham. We lost that one. Had we flipped those 3 states, right, no one would be saying Joe Manchin's name, right? He can vote against anything he wanted. Same with Sinema, who's like even more annoying, right? So for everything that you just said, and who wrote the original reconciliation bill with the social justice stuff in it? Bernie wrote it, right? So we would have had a Bernie bill. The Bernie bill passed the House, right? So the lousy ass Democratic Party that you're rightly saying is, beholden to donor class, passed a bill that was half written by Bernie Sanders that would have made a really remarkable change in our social contract. And on climate change, which we talked about earlier, it would have made significant inroads, and was torpedoed by frickin' Joe Manchin, who, the coal miner, right? Who's like indebted to literal physical, like the actual big coal in his own state, which is destroying his state, but he's still right. So like, he's hardly, reflecting the interests of his constituents, right? That is like a perfect example of like his donors versus his constituents. Yeah. These people who are trashing West Virginia and, poisoning their own workers at, with crappy ass low wage jobs. And that's the people he's supporting. But we're only in this pickle because we didn't flip these other states. So I don't, I don't buy into like the premise that it's the party that's the problem. It's the fact that not enough people gave a crap. And again, had young people voted in Maine and in North and South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, Susan Collins, and I forgot who the North Carolina guy is, would be out of office. So yeah, but it's the same thing. Like we could debate it forever, because you could be like, yeah, but if there was a real left, then they would have voted for the real left and the Democrats wouldn't sap off the energy. But I just don't, when I look state by state, district by district, zip code by zip code, right now with the current electorate, and it might change in 10 or 15 years when those 18 to 25s get a little bit older. Right now, there's just not enough people who agree with you to like swing any of these elections. So even if there were a vibrant left-wing party that wasn't co-opted by all the bullshit, which I don't know if I'm allowed to say bullshit,
of course you are.
Which the Democrats are, there's just not yet enough people. But eventually, I think you're going to win, because I do think that certainly once climate change gets even worse, and if you really look at what Gen Z says they think, and even some millennials, percentage wise feel like they think, the future does seem to look a lot more like AOC and a lot less like Joe Manchin. Whether that's enough for you, I don't know, but that does look like the demographic future, fortunately.
Yeah, I mean, we'll move on. There's a couple things I could, I of course could say. One of them being the time span that we're on, the gradualist, incrementalist, reform-oriented processes and paths seem to be wholly inadequate compared to the timeline of like climate catastrophe, as well as like the homelessness crisis, healthcare, et cetera. But we'll see. One thing I do want to say to those on my side of the line is like there tends to be this idea sometimes floated on the more socialist left that the only way that we'll ever be able to meaningfully address climate change is after we have some sort of socialist reorientation of the global economy. And I just think that that's not going to be possible. It's not going to happen. The timelines do not match up at all. So for better or worse, we are going to have to attempt to meaningfully address the climate crisis, at least for now, within the confines of the capitalist, democratic, liberal world order. And, maybe in that process of meaningfully having to wrestle with the climate crisis, we will see some seeds of socialism crop up around the world. We'll see certain societies experiment with different economic modes of production and relations of production. And maybe one of those will be wildly successful and begin to spread in almost like a little laboratory of real democracy. So yeah, it remains to be seen. We shall see, but I appreciate you going back and forth with me on that. To move forward a little bit, just to maybe just touch one more time on something we've already kind of brought up, but is somewhat like the broken institutions and like seemingly unresponsive mechanisms of American government, regardless of our views on economics or ideology or anything, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or anything else. It just seems like the American government, for a multitude of reasons, just can't do anything. It can barely solve basic routine social problems that other countries can solve without any, uproar at all, just like as the way of doing things. So I'm just wondering what role you think that plays, if that's going to change, or if there has to be some, more radical reform to address the gridlock and the divisiveness of the current American political system.
Yeah, I mean, I again, like, bring it back to that spiritual political nexus, which is where I think the interesting stuff is. Clearly between 30 and 50% of America is like on a really different page from where you and I are in terms of what these challenges are. So, like, for them, the challenges are like the losing of white supremacy. Like, they wouldn't say that out loud, of course, but like, right, they would describe it as immigration, or, cancel culture or woke culture or whatever. Like, they'll talk about it, or critical race theory, which I can't even say with a straight face because I studied actual critical race theory in law school. Like, so it's just it's like funny if you like imagine yourself going to like grad school or something and you learn some like obscure thing that like 5 professors care about, and then somehow 25 years later, it becomes like, the rallying cry to win the governorship of Virginia or something. It's so bizarre.
Surreal.
Like, anyway, so they won't say it's about white supremacy, but they'll say, right, critical race theory, whatever, right? And like that's, or the decline in, in morality, the erosion of traditional gender roles. Like, this is what, again, 30 to 50% of Americans see as like the main problem. And they see us, you and me and others, as like part of that problem, right? So I sort of think that the divisiveness of American politics is actually reflective of the divided nature of Americans, and it's accurately reflecting that. Like, I think, I'm a little more optimistic on some of the problems that government has solved and is continuing to solve, but clearly, let's take paid family leave, right? The idea that like that one issue is somehow like a huge stumbling block in the current moment is crazy, right? When you look at like every other Western democracy, which, pays months and months of family leave, and we were like, we couldn't get through a week or something. So like, that's a good example, but like that reflects not, to me, that doesn't reflect the sort of failure of politics. It's like, that's politics reflecting a failure of our culture. And somewhere along the line, and, we could spend a different hour talking about that, a third of our country, which is evangelical Christian in religious belief, or if that's even a religious belief anymore, more than a political belief, has a view, that if we have a socialist state, which 2 weeks of paid family leave would be the equivalent of socialism for them. That will destroy our values, and it'll destroy manhood, and it'll encourage lazy people, by which they mean Black people, because for them it's all racialized, right? And that this would be like a terrible thing for our society. And so like the battle line isn't between you and me, right? It's not between like, should we have 3 months of paid family leave per year, or should we even have a whole different system where it's not capitalist at all? The dividing line is like fundamental on sort of what are the challenges that our country faces. And again, it vacillates between 30 and 50%. And sometimes that 50% is enough to win a presidential election, as it did in 2016. So it's that for me is the challenge. So it's not, I don't have the view that like, if the people with a capital P, like, were to rise up, we would end up somewhere better. Because again, between a third and a half of those people think that what we need is a kind of theocracy, where moral values derived from a certain fundamentalist view of religion are driving government decisions. Maybe I'm more pessimistic than you.
I'm not sure. There's definitely that truth of like the backlash and just the way that America is structured, settler colonialism, history of white supremacy, the increasing urge on the American right to institute some form of minoritarian rule, the amount of just guns, and the psychology of reactionaries who, sort of view themselves in a possible prelude to an action movie where they're running around shooting people they dislike. Any attempt by the left or the right to rise up in any real meaningful way to try to actually go after political power will be met with a huge backlash from the other side and inevitably go into something like a civil war, unfortunately. But I do think one of the things that the right has done, and it kind of shot themselves in the foot, is for my entire life, I'm 32, calling everything good socialism, and then they wonder why 60%
they've done a good PR job.
They really have.
Right?
Paid leave is socialism. Wearing a mask is socialism. Healthcare for your family is socialism. Action on climate change is socialism. Oh yeah, 70% of young Americans are socialists now. Oops. So I think that's kind of a funny thing. But yeah, we'll see. So let's go ahead and just, you've been very generous with your time. So last question here. I heard you say on 10% Happier that you assumed in the 90s when you were even writing on the climate crisis that only once the impacts of climate change really became clear to everyone would we see meaningful action. But as you said in that episode, and we see quite clearly, the past few years have proven that even scenes straight out of an apocalyptic dystopian movie haven't been enough to really spur action. So in your opinion, what will it take? And ultimately, how optimistic are you that we can keep warming below catastrophic levels, 2, 2.5, 3 degrees, etc.?
Yeah. So, I mean, I saw, this is like it's the hardest question in a certain way, because it's the hardest for me it's my own Joanna Macy moment, right? Where I have to confront the thing that's hard to put up with. And so what you said is accurate. I wrote in a bunch of articles a long time ago that, this is a temporary problem because by the time climate change happens, we'll see it, but the problem is by then it'll be too late. Well, now it's too late, right? Whether it's wildfires or floods or hurricanes and whatever, and people still are in a level of either denial or disinterest. And by the way, the hardcore denialists in the United States are now fewer than 20%. The people who are like, climate change is a hoax, it's not happening. So there's actually pretty good news on that. But there's still about 25 to 30% who are like, yeah, it's an issue, but it's exaggerated, or it's half natural or whatever, just as a side note. For me, what's actually been the most disturbing, and it may not seem related at first, again, has been the pandemic, right? So with COVID, the science is clear, the effects are clear, everything's pretty clear. Of course, there's stuff we don't know and whatever, but on the basics of the transmission of this virus and its effects, pretty clear. Super safe vaccine, which now 2 billion people or something have received at least one dose of, and yet there's still not just random denialism, but violent, crazy people, right? And that again is maybe 20%. That's not a majority of the country. That's not 30 to 50%, but there's a significant chunk of Americans who are putting themselves and their kids and their parents at serious risk, right? People are killing their own family members, for crying out loud, and not, in the face of this obvious contrary evidence, creating wild sort of conspiracy theories to deny reality. And I find that really challenging and terrifying around when it comes to climate change, right? So if we have a real life crisis that happens that involves science and, things in the world, and such a large number of people for whatever deep felt psychological or social or cultural reasons, prefer to inhabit a fantasy world of conspiracy theory and nonsense, from ivermectin to space aliens, literally, when it comes to COVID. What does that mean for climate change? Right. So even if things continue to get way worse, so there's now climate refugees, hundreds of millions of climate refugees around the world, and, coastal cities in non-affluent countries are inundated, and it's very sobering to see how much tragedy so many people are willing to put up with before making a change. So ultimately, I would say I'm somewhat optimistic that some changes will happen relatively soon, actually, and they're already happening. And again, if you take someone like Joe Manchin, if you see where he is now compared to where he was 10 years ago, he has moved. And again, the guy's from a freaking coal mining state, but that obviously is not enough. So I'm pessimistic that our children's world. And it's funny, I don't know if it's true for you, but when I became a parent, that cliche turned very real.
Oh yeah.
Politicians say that crap all the time. What kind of world are we leaving our children?
Yes.
But one kind of that actually did change for me. Now I'm thinking about my child. It's a little selfish, really. But if you think about it, oh, who cares about those billion other kids? But what about my kid?
Yeah.
But, that's maybe how the human mind works. It does become very concrete, and you think about what world my kid's going to live in, in 20 or 30 years. And I definitely think it's going to be a very different world. And there was some new data that came out this past week about what Gen Z thinks about their world. And one contributing factor to them being so socialist is they assume that the economic system is going to, if not collapse, then at least like not support, lifestyles the way it is right now, in part because of climate change. So it is interesting, maybe too light a word, to like see how people who are affected by these changes also perceive them. But I come back to like, well, what's possible? Probably my most controversial idea, which we haven't talked about, is like I actually kind of like geoengineering, and can talk about that in another podcast episode. Sure. People can Google me in that name. In fact, I'll just say really briefly that there's a conspiracy theory about geoengineering, which is like intentionally manipulating the atmosphere, that has to do with the chemtrails, which is like this conspiracy theory about the contrails that come out of airplane exhaust. Yeah. And somehow I managed to get sucked into that as like I'm part of the bad guys wanting to poison America or whatever, keep us docile by spraying chemicals from airplanes. That's my claim to fame, is a tertiary role in a conspiracy theory. Anyway, away from the conspiracy theory, in reality, I think there are some actions that we will eventually have to take that are dangerous, but are less dangerous than the alternative. So that's actually a pessimistic ending point. I do think we will avert global catastrophe, but by doing other things that will also be catastrophic.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. Just for the chemtrail point, it was always funny to me because it never made sense why, this cabal of people who ostensibly live in the world and have family and kids in the world would want to poison the skies that they themselves have to breathe. That's a good point. Always an interesting hole in that conspiracy theory.
Well, maybe they're the lizard people, so they're not affected by that.
Yeah, but I have had on Holly Jean Buck, who wrote After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration, for an interesting perspective. And I do think that there is this knee-jerk refusal to even think about those things on the left, and for good reason. We don't want that to become a replacement for actually decarbonizing. And there's plenty of potholes to hit on the path towards any form of geoengineering. But I also had on Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote A Ministry for the Future, and in that book, he depicts a context in which climate change gets so bad globally that certain countries more or less go rogue and begin engaging in their own forms of geoengineering, regardless of like a global agreement or anything, and all the conflicts that can create. So however it happens, either rationally and strategically or more of a last minute Hail Mary, I think it's going to play a role. But obviously decarbonizing is the biggest thing.
I just learned another word from Kim Stanley Robinson, who I just Googled when you mentioned them. Cli-fi. I hadn't seen that word before. Climate fiction. So there you go.
It's really good. And we're seeing more of that.
We're living in cli-fi. We don't need the fi anymore.
Exactly.
Climate reality is quickly becoming as terrifying as climate fiction.
Yeah, it's true. Just one point on the optimism point is just that I've long argued, and I've had, periods even this year of like doom spiraling into depression and anxiety about the future that my kids, my nieces and nephews are all going to have to inhabit. But one thing is true, which is the more that the impacts continue to become obvious and continue to impact more and more people, the more action you'll see. And I think there is this generational divide. If you're like a 65-year-old Republican, you have an ideological tendency to not believe in this stuff. But you're also, especially if you don't have a lot of empathy for other people, or maybe don't have grandkids you particularly give a shit about, you can just sort of poo-poo it and like, well, who cares? It's probably not real. It's all a hoax. But if you're like a 15-year-old kid, you just don't have that luxury. It's your entire future. And more kids are becoming aware of that. And I think as we see them grow up into political activity and political age, we'll see more and more pushback. The political systems around the world will reflect the will from the people of wanting more movement on it. And I think we might be, in the best case scenario, in this sort of interregnum where, the consciousness is getting to the point, reaching that threshold. The political and economic and leaders and systems are lagging behind, but eventually they'll catch up, and we will more or less get this thing under control. But even in the best case scenario, huge amounts of needless suffering around the world. So.
Yeah, let me, I just want to respond to that quickly. I know we're running up on time, but first, a very smart friend of mine suggested that Gen Z are the people who were born after an inconvenient truth came out. And for a lot of older folks, certainly boomers and stuff, like climate change is new. Even, it's now been, we've known about for 30 years, but it's new in terms of their lives. Like before it was not a thing, and then it became a thing. And for people who are now 20, it's always been a thing since before they could remember, right? So they've grown up with it being a thing, and they understand, some percentage of them understand, what it's going to lead to in their own lives. And I think you're right that and if you look by analogy at other transformative things, so like look at how, again, Zoomers, or even older than Gen Z, like 18 to 25, look at gender, for example, right? So I grew up at a time, I didn't know what transgender was. Like I was like in my 20s before I heard that word, right? And I'm in the queer community, right? So like I had no idea. Like I just didn't, I knew the word transvestite or whatever, but I didn't know anyone trans, certainly. Yeah. So for me, it's new in a certain way. And I had to like do some work on myself and see my own stuff and my own, biases around that. Whereas again, if you're 18 or something, that's just part of your world, right? And you probably know people who are non-binary or genderqueer, and like, so it's not, and we see that on race, we see it on a lot of issues where like when people have to like learn it when they're old, like me, they don't quite get it in the way that when people are growing up with that. So I think you're right. It goes like, again, to time horizon. Like if we could just hand the reins to that generation now, we'd have immediate action. But unfortunately, by the time they seize power, it's going to take some time. But I did notice that you said, about cycles of depression and anxiety, and that did trigger my meditation teacher self, which is like, that's the perfect illustration, right, of what we've talked about for most of our time, which is that nexus point of where contemplative practice can really help, right? So we know, or should know, that just sort of as an analytical, rational matter, like cycles of depression and anxiety are not helpful. They're not empowering you, right? It's not like those cycles are making you a better activist or podcaster or whatever, right? Those are debilitating. Yeah. So that's where you already have enough information, right? And now you've gone over into the too much information side, let's say, and it's leading to those adverse consequences that are holding you back. That is the perfect time where your practice can hopefully come in and be helpful, right? Where there should still be sadness and fear about the future when you think rationally about it, right? Because that's a rational response to what the data is saying. You should, if you're not feeling like sadness and fear and worry, you're not understanding, right? Exactly. But when when sadness turns into despair, or where fear turns into anxiety, that's where you can actually find it. And the sort of key jujitsu move of meditation, and I know you know this, but just for listeners, is not making the bad stuff go away. That's not the move. It's actually the opposite. It's like, okay, wow, I feel a lot of sadness, fear, anger, and anxiousness about the future for my kids and the rest of the kids in the planet. Here's what this is, and I can be with it. And I don't have to spiral it, and I can see myself spiraling. And that's where I could choose not to do something, not to make the bad feeling go away, but like, I don't have to make it worse. Right. And I know what I do when I spiral, and I can see that happening, and that I can nip in the bud, right? That I can stop before it blossoms. Yeah. And so like, I think you it was a aside, it wasn't your main point, but like that sort of, for me, is that perfect illustration of what we've talked about, which is where contemplative practice can be an ally to people who are politically engaged.
Yeah, beautifully said. I could not agree more. In Buddhism, there's that concept of the two arrows of suffering. The first thing that you can't change, the fact of climate change, but that second arrow of suffering we so often inflict on ourselves, which is spiraling, getting identified with the fear and the thoughts and the anxiety, and not having that space to step back and sort of dispassionately engage with those feelings, as opposed to suffer under their weight. And so that's always helpful to think about. Jay, it's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. I really also appreciate the back and forth politically. It can always be a little uncomfortable, but I really appreciate hearing your perspective. Before I let you go, can you just please let our listeners know where they can find you and your work online?
Sure. So I have a website, jmichaelson.net. And as we mentioned, I also work for 10% Happier, which is at 10%, all spelled out, .com. And the newsletter is free. And if some of the approach to meditation that I've sketched out here, I don't write it every week, but I edit it. So you can find kind of diverse approaches that are aligned with that at 10%.com/newsletter.
Awesome. And I'll link to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again, Jay. It's been a wonderful conversation.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
Think about the old days more and more, the pettiness of my life and the way it was. If I speak to you through a dream, would you hear me? Across this lonesome country, across the great divide, over the people trying to get by, I use the venue Wi-Fi. I checked my email twice as I sat and cried. The singer from the other band asked if I was alright, and they sat with me a while in the cool dark country. It seemed that we were going to be linked forever in deeper understanding of ways we've been moving around, the ways we think about ourselves in this moment, in all the years gone by, in all the people that we pass by, and what might happen if we actually looked them in the eye. And as I write this down, I could feel it all now. The words rush in a moment, and the part of my life that's kept me hiding inside has died. The soul in my heart is always hungry and lost in the deep wide country. Been thinking about the old days more and more, the pettiness of my life and the way it was. If I speak to you through a dream, would you hear